We would like to welcome five-time Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist, Sharyl Attkisson.
Thank you for coming. Can I say something first?
Please, yes.
You know, I was born in St. Petersburg. Went to school with me or are related to me, clap.
So thank you again for coming in the weather. Glad you made it safely. And I'm sure more people will be coming in as we go, but we'll go ahead and get started. So we have a mix tonight of members from the public as well as St. Petersburg College students. So we try to tailor our questions for that mixed group. I want to start off by asking Sharyl, what is an investigative reporter, and when did you figure out that that's what you wanted to do?
I think it was never part of a plan, but to be an investigative reporter isn't all that hard. It just means when you're reporting but you ask an extra question, or you don't just accept and take what's handed out or what's given on a press release, which is my nature, to do something that goes another step further, and that makes you an investigative reporter. So I realized working at CBS News, my goal was to give what I call added value. Why would I report on a story that was the same as what everybody else was reporting if I couldn't find out something more or a little different, a viewpoint maybe that wasn't being represented? I didn't think there was much point to it, so that's what interested me about being investigative.
Very good, very good. So you've won 5 Emmys. What did you win it for? Any of them stand out to you?
Well, probably the first one, which was investigating the Ford Firestone tire fiasco when the Ford trucks were rolling over. Some of you may be too young to remember this, but there was just a huge scandal because the companies had covered up for many years. We uncovered documentary evidence that they knew this combination of Firestone tires with these Ford vehicles, the Explorers, was a recipe for disaster, and a lot of people died as a result of this. Also, maybe actually, I didn't win an Emmy for that. I was nominated for an Emmy. Should have won an Emmy for that. The first one was the Red Cross. After 9/11, I did a series investigating misspending, waste, fraud, and abuse in the Red Cross. That story would never be done today because we wouldn't be allowed, and the way the turn news has taken, we wouldn't be allowed to do this reporting on a big, powerful group like the Red Cross. But at the time, I had the best source, who I could say, one of my sources, who she is now because she's passed away, but it was the head of the Red Cross. Wow. It was a secret source. And she had, the agency was so powerful around her. It was Dr. Bernadine Healy, former head of the National Institutes of Health. She was appalled by so many things at the Red Cross, but couldn't do anything about it, because much like our government, she was sort of there, but everybody around her was stopping her from being able to change or fix things. So she was giving me information at the same time the Red Cross was insisting none of it was true. I knew it was true. She had given me documentary evidence and audits. So that was my first Emmy win.
Wow. The organization had taken life of its own, and it veered off the rails, and she, as an ethical leader, was trying to correct that, but the organization was trying to fight it. Very interesting.
It's a common theme, whether it's a government or corporations. There's a lot of wonderful, well-meaning people that work inside these organizations. They become sources of mine in some of my stories, but the bureaucracy itself and the abusive players in it who can control things tend to be able to cover up a lot.
Right, that's some source. Yeah. So you started off, you had a long career in local news, and then you went to CNN, PBS, CBS, and you left to start your own independent program almost 5 years ago, right? What changes have you seen in the news industry during your career?
The reason I left CBS when I did, ahead of my contract, I thought I was going to spend the rest of my career there, I planned to. There's just massive changes in the news industry in a way that made the kind of reporting that I do almost impossible to do. And other reporters struggle with the same thing, but really can't up and leave their jobs. They try to negotiate and operate within it. But I wrote about this in Stonewalled and The Smear, 2 books. But to shorthand it, our industry has undergone a radical transformation of who controls what we do. And we've allowed it to happen. We've allowed propagandists and players in public relations and other political and corporate environments. We've invited them into our newsrooms to make decisions, to write the stories, to be our bosses, to be analysts on TV. And we've accepted this in an uncritical way that's compromised, in my view, what we do, and that affects everything you see on the news today. The kinds of stories you see, the way they're reported, and most importantly, what you don't see.
Yeah, so if you would maybe think about, I listened to some of your other interviews, some of the stories that I think, if I remember your interview correctly, you said, like the last 6 months you were at CBS, you and your producer sat trying to figure out stories that would actually make it to the news, because everything had been stopped before that. What were some of the ones that you would have liked to report, or you thought really the public should know about, but were stopped?
Well, for many years, almost any story I investigated or offered a, call it an offer inside the news industry, the bosses would take. The bosses in New York liked that, wanted that. The viewers really liked those kinds of stories, and they were added value. But as this environment changed that I'm describing, it came to the point where almost nothing I could do. It's easy if they don't like one story to move on to something else. How many stories are out there waiting to be done? But it got to a point where nothing we offered was anything they would want. And one big example is, they would assign me to dig into a story, but then not want it. After there were certain kinds of pressure or certain decisions about who that might impact. One of them was, remember the Boeing Dreamliner fires? CBS came to me at some point and said, please investigate this. They would do that with a topic. And I broke what I think was one of the bigger stories I broke there, finding sort of the source of the fires with a whistleblower that had blown the whistle years before, had documentary evidence, a court case. I had an interview with a former head of transportation official that said this was the smoking gun. Checked it out very carefully. We had video of fires that had occurred when they were developing the prototype battery and charger. This fire had blown up a whole factory, and this guy, this whistleblower, had gotten blamed for the fire when he tried to blow the whistle on what was wrong and why they were catching fire. We did an interview with him. Everybody thought it was a great story, and when it went up to New York, this is when Scott Kelly and Shetland had taken over the evening news broadcast. It never aired. We were told all kinds of reasons. They never say, we don't want that story. I suspect, because this is often the case, corporate officials made contacts, or else we were just self-censoring because we were worried about the power of some of these companies that we report on, their connections with our corporate people or our advertisers. So that story never aired, and that was just kind of like a deal breaker for me. It was bad.
And I think Boeing is one of the #1 exporters of American goods.
I think it's #1.
Yeah.
Very powerful. And as I was covering the story, I would call battery experts to try to get interviews and information. And everything's connected when you start to see things from where I sit. And these battery people that wanted to talk about it and kind of knew what was wrong said that Boeing had been calling around and telling them, if you talk, you'll never get another job, because these people's contract for the industry, they need jobs. And I was told they were calling on Capitol Hill. There were supposed to be hearings, but no hearings ever materialized. So there's ways for the environment to be controlled, and either, again, we self-censored or we had been contacted. I don't know which it is, but another, I thought, funny story. The Follow the Money stories I did at CBS, for a while we did one every Friday on earmarks, were some of the most popular stories they said they ever had. They could tell who's watching minute to minute. And when this new generation came in at the end in those last 2 years, the subtle changes they started making were included, I would always write your tax money. So when they're spending something, I wanted to remind people, this doesn't come out of the blue, this is money we pay in taxes. Because believe it or not, over the years of reporting, I've learned not everybody really makes that connection. And all of a sudden, my stories the script started getting changed. So they'd go to New York and it would come back and your tax money would be changed to federal money. And I used to say, that's such a tiny change, why are they doing it? But it was a part of a pattern of somebody not wanting to remind people that that was, I think, your money. And so these were like, that's how the changes began. And then they just didn't want any taxpayer waste stories, as popular as they were. that became a no-go after years of doing it. And there's still at Full Measure, where I work now, that's one of our most popular things that we do. But you won't see the networks doing many of those anymore these days.
Yeah, it's, I think one of the ones that I heard you talk about was the school lunch program. And I have a son who's in public schools, and he doesn't eat the lunches. That's another story. But if I have the story right, they were feeding the students substandard food to save money, and you had a whistleblower on that, and is that?
Well, you know, I try to ask the questions instead of taking the stories that are handed to us, and we're handed stories all the time by PR agencies and nonprofits that actually work for somebody. I try to think of my own. And having a kid in school and hearing parents talk, everybody wanted to know, why is the food so bad at school? You know, why is it horrible? Just not nutritious, doesn't taste good. So my producer and I poked around, and we did find that there was a big case going, I believe it's New York's Attorney General, against these companies we don't know much about, one of them was Sodexo, for allegedly giving kickbacks to the schools the more of this yucky, fatty, cheap food they would order. And they actually would place people in the schools, you think of the cafeteria lady, but they work for these third parties. They were giving supposedly improper bribes and kickbacks, and it was a big case, but we actually found a whistleblower who's now working at a school where they grow all their food fresh on the campus, and they do it completely differently. But it was sort of I thought, big, original, interesting story of widespread interest. And the morning show, it was for the morning show, was so excited to have it. You know, they just kept saying, when can we have the script? So I wrote it really fast. And before I sent it to them, they suddenly changed to, oh, we don't want to look at the script. Or we changed our mind about the story. I'm like, how could you change your mind when you haven't even seen the interviews or what the story says? And they never did air that story. And my producer and I racked our brains. What about the story is stepping on whose toes? That was always the game we had to try to figure out. And the only thing we could figure was Michelle Obama, about that time, was making school lunch improvement her signature cost, which I thought complemented the story. My story didn't fight that, but I think there was a decision, this is all I can assume, I don't know that this is the case, that someone thought that was going to somehow hurt
the optics.
Yeah.
So we, in our ethics program here, one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about are whistleblowers. And we want to make sure that our students understand that a whistleblower isn't just someone who is unhappy and goes to their boss, but it's actually a process of trying to get things fixed within an organization and then going outside the organization. So now that you have a reputation as someone doing honest investigative reporting, you probably have whistleblowers come to you. But what have you learned about whistleblowers working with so many through the years?
Whistleblowers are strange people. If you think of the personality that it takes to see something wrong and be willing to ultimately go to, most of them don't like the press, that's the last place they want to go, but they're so mad about what's happening, and they're obstinate, and they usually have a pretty strong moral compass. Sometimes something's happened to them personally, sometimes not. And they have to be treated a certain way. One thing I tell them, they always want to know, if I do this story and if I speak on camera, will it fix X? And I tell them, probably not. You know, the truth is, it never turns out for the whistleblower. Their life always gets worse because of it, even though there's supposedly protections and things like that. But most of them, by the time they've reached the point where they've gone internally and tried to fix things, and they've gone through the process, and they come to me or agree to talk to me, they're so disgusted that they're okay with that. That's kind of surprising. But I think you have to treat them with a lot of respect and understanding about how much their life has been destroyed, and you have to check them out pretty carefully. I've been lucky I haven't had a whistleblower that I use that turned out to be a fraud or bad, but I'm always trying to be cognizant of someone that's not telling the truth or has ulterior motives that might mean that what the information they're giving me isn't right.
And I guess that'd probably be some of the best advice for whistleblowers is, if you think this is going to end well, think again. Is that what?
Well, yes, and the best I tell them is, if nothing else, the story that I do, the resulting story, will serve as an internet resource for other people like you, or for people who can't get this information anywhere else. Maybe it's being covered up or the rest of the press won't report it, but this story will live, and to the extent that they're trying to censor our searches now on the internet, these stories will be able to be found until this information is more controlled, as I think we're moving into that territory. But I tell people there will be a resource for other people to see and hear that this really happened, and maybe where they can go if they have a similar issue.
I know that you've done a lot of work on vaccines, but I also know that since you've been around the world, you've probably had a lot of vaccines yourself. So
I'm over-vaccinated.
Over-vaccinated, yeah. And so you're not, I guess what they would call like anti-vax, and but I do remember a story that you tried to run, and it had to do with a doctor at the CDC who had done some research that said that people, when they get, I think it was over 70, might not want to have the flu vaccine.
The flu shot, yeah.
And that story was killed.
I think, did they run? They actually ran that story. This is before they wouldn't run it today.
Mm-hmm.
But who tried to kill it was the federal government. So the story with that is, and vaccines is this whole crazy animal I had to learn about. Because if you say most medicine has side effects and it should be safer, nobody thinks you're crazy, but if you say vaccines, which is a medicine, has some side effects and they should be safer, people are like, you're crazy, you're crazy. So I had to understand there's a whole movement of propaganda funded by government pharma that's designed to make people think you shouldn't even talk about that. But CBS had assigned me to cover some of these issues, and this one was fascinating. I ran across government study that was about to come out that was supposed to be the definitive study that proved flu shots work in old people. Because we've always given flu shots to old people, and it's always presumed that they work. But the way the scientist explained it to me, that was in charge of the study, she said, actually the studies always show that they don't work. So we set about to do the definitive study proving it works, which is all totally non-scientific, like the idea that you go in with a bias and you're trying to make a study come out a certain way. But she acknowledged, we figured the other studies have to be wrong because everybody knows the flu shots help. Well, when this study came out, she said we adjusted for all kinds of factors to try the aging population. We did everything we could to make it come out right, and it still showed that more people died, not were saved, the more older people that got vaccinated. And I said, well, that's fascinating, you know, because there's some side effects with flu shots, and nobody knows this. Will you do an interview? She's like, absolutely, this is very important, because she said, we as scientists came into this with a pro-bias that we thought this worked, this is very important information. Well, the government wouldn't let her do an interview, but I did get an interview. There was one independent doctor from Harvard who said the same thing on camera. I flew up there, and he was like the others. He's like, I love flu shots. I always thought they worked in older people. There's many reasons why we think they may not, but the fact is people ought to know. And most of you probably don't even know about this study. It was the definitive government study that you're not going to see widely reported.
So again, we're not anti-vax, but one of the ones, I asked my students for questions. And I had a student, and she had a personal experience where she had received the Gardasil vaccine. And she told me that within a couple weeks of having the vaccine, she developed a cardiac condition. And she had been to doctors at the Mayo Clinic and to Vanderbilt, and they had attributed it to Gardasil. What did you find about Gardasil? Or what have you?
Well, I was introduced to that vaccine when I was covering other stories, and that was just coming on the market. And I met a whistleblower that worked for the company that alleged that he knew a lot about various vaccine scandals inside the company, but one of them was, he said that he was in a meeting where they discussed this vaccine and another. They had spent a great deal of money, obviously in development, only to find out, he claimed, that it didn't work. And not only did it not work, he said it caused cancer in animal studies and it caused some reproductive issues. And he said, but at this meeting, we decided there was going to be the largest ad campaign in history to market this drug so that before anybody knew in 30 years that the women getting at age X, when they turn 50 or 60, maybe it doesn't really work, or they have other issues, they'll have all the money. I'm sure it wasn't stated quite as cynically as that, but this was his message to me. So they launched $1 billion ad campaign. I think it was called One More or One Less more or less. And it's been a huge sell. They've expanded it to boys. A big story after that came out a while. I read an article in the New York Times, just a little blurb about one of the lead researchers for that medicine, for Gardasil, was kind of criticizing it. She was upset at the marketing and learning new stuff the longer the drug was on the market. So I called her and she cautiously said the same thing to me, that she was worried about the mass marketing and that she worried that the vaccine could prove to be more harmful than the disease it purports to prevent, if it even works. And I said, will you do an interview? I mean, I've never heard of a drug company developer, a co-researcher speaking out against her own medicine. She's cutting her career completely off. She said, yes, I'll do an interview. So I called, this is during this time period, I called Evening News, surely you want this story. They're like, no. So I called the morning show, well, they'll definitely want it. I called them, they're like, oh, that sounds great. They call back, no. So I wrote it up for the web. It lives on the website at CBS, but nobody would air the piece, which I think is a really important story.
So the aforementioned 5-year-old that resides in my house, what advice would you give me for him with his vaccines?
Wow. I blame the government because it's so conflicted and in bed with pharma and so unwilling to address these issues that it's made some people just not vaccinate at all. That's the government's fault, in my view, by not being clear. They say, oh, parents are crazy. Well, they're crazy because they know some of what you're saying isn't true, and you're not giving them a path for figuring out what's true, so they're overreacting and not vaccinating. I think it's a very tough landscape to navigate. My kid was fully vaccinated on time. This is before I knew anything about the stories, but were I to do it again, I would simply say, look for signs after your kid gets a shot. All those signs that they say are normal, the high-pitched scream and the strange behavior is not, this is my opinion based on the scientists I've talked to, is not normal. I mean, it may happen a lot, but that ain't normal. That may be the kid's body having an autoimmune reaction that's upsetting. And then I would reconsider whether you want to give another challenge quickly. I would also, if I could do it again, vaccinate separately one at a time. I've learned this is not a dispute, that's safer. If you could give MMR as M and then M and then R, there's fewer side effects, but they don't offer it. When they found out parents wanted to do that, there was an effort to not allow them by just offering only the bundled vaccine. So there's certain things. I would never give a kid the polio shot. The oral. I would give the shot. The oral, which my kid had, which they don't tell you, has live polio virus in it, and very rarely gives people polio. The last cases of polio in this country were from the vaccine, and they finally pulled it off the market. But they had the shot available at the time, and the shot carries 0 chance of transmitting polio. So if the doctor had put it to me that way, I would have given my kid the shot. Instead, they said, does your daughter want sugar water or a shot? And I said, sugar water.
Who doesn't want sugar water?
We all want sugar water.
Thank you. Can we get your water open? Or you want me to?
Just here's the Marine.
So, well, I figured I'd help you with that because now we're going to start talking about the book.
Okay.
So, those of you who don't know, she has her latest New York Times bestseller. We have it out in the lobby if you haven't got it yet. It's called The Smear. And part of what The Smear talks about is fake news. So maybe we'll start off that and then get into The Smear. What is fake news?
It depends on who you ask. There's 2 definitions. It's to liberals who created the phrase, I traced it to September 13th, 2016. Most of you probably think it's been around a long time, but in its popular usage, it was introduced right before the election. And I researched this heavily for the book because I was surprised too. A nonprofit used the phrase, it's called First Draft, in September of 2016, saying there was a need to curate, all this fake news and information. I remember thinking, that's a little strange. A month later, President Obama came out and said, at a speech at Carnegie Mellon, that somebody needed to step forward and curate information in the wild, wild west media environment. And I remember at the time thinking, no one's asking anybody to do that. Like, no one in the public was saying, please, third party, come in and control what I see. So I knew that was some sort of initiative. I just hadn't figured out yet what it was. As time went on, I think this was an effort to develop a pretext to control the information we see online and other places, searches or social media. But then conservatives took it over. They didn't anticipate a Trump, who I don't think anybody else but him could have done this, who started saying, oh yeah, you think that's fake news? You're fake news, and then throw it back. And it worked for him to such a degree that the people who were promoting the phrase eventually started going, we should stop talking about fake news. In fact, the Washington Post in January of, I think, 2017, posted and said we should stop talking about all that fake news. So that's the origin, and Trump means it as the media that purposely, repeatedly prints biased information that they should know is incorrect, or they're so sloppy they don't care. And liberals mean it as just intentional fake news, and there is that. There are websites that were ginned up that had just entirely false information being pushed out to confuse or...
Yeah, I remember watching a YouTube video before the election, and YouTube's algorithm picks, and some of the videos that they picked afterwards, I mean, the first video was a legitimate speech or something like that, and then afterwards it was bizarre. And I thought, this, you know, I think I have enough common sense to differentiate some fake news. But, so you have that too, you have to, but what is the smear industry? And why did you decide to expose it?
One final point on the fake news. The nonprofit that mentioned it, called First Draft, if you follow the money, you can usually get an answer to a question. So I wanted to know who funded First Draft and the anti-fake news effort. And I found out it was Google. Google's parent company is Alphabet. Alphabet was run at the time by a man named Eric Schmidt, who is Hillary Clinton's top campaign donor and had volunteered to be a consultant and an advisor. So if you look at it, and he started, that company was funded, or the nonprofit was funded around the start of the election cycle. So it looks to me like a very deliberate effort, not something that, so that's kind of what the smear is about, how a lot of what we see that appears, made to appear organic and naturally occurring, like you just found out about it, that the news is just happening to report it. These are ideas that are placed before us every day by a multi-billion-dollar industry that seeks to control the narratives and manipulate what we think, whether it's using social media or the news or other tactics. And the industry's grown up, you know, Washington, D.C. based, but they operate around the world. And these are nonprofits, think tanks, LLCs, charities that you think, you know, have innocuous, nice-sounding names, but may be funded or acting in the interest of some party that you don't, financial interest you don't know about. Their websites, their super PACs, there's just every kind of organization imaginable is working in this, what I call the smear industry. And it's sort of a sequel to Stonewall because it explains why the news industry, what the forces are behind the changes that we see in the news industry and in our information landscape.
In this smear you talked about rubber board, right? And Clarence Thomas a little bit. And I guess, and now we're kind of seeing that again this week with the latest nominee for the Supreme Court. But what distinguishes between a legitimate critique or legitimate questions, legitimate investigation, and a smear?
For my purposes, the definition of the smear I use for the book, it doesn't always mean it's false information, but it means that the information may be amplified by a hidden interest that has financial motives that's not revealing itself. So maybe there's I call it a grain of truth in some smears that I criticize or I highlight, because that grain of truth is being used and amplified by forces, these forces I talk about, who have a hidden interest. Maybe they claim moral outrage, but what they don't tell you is that they have financial backers or power interests behind them that are leading them to do the things that they do.
And I don't know why people seem surprised, because people with power want more power, and people with power want more money. And now, I guess with social media and all this stuff, it gives people the opportunity to try to protect their power or grow it. You had the whole chapter on Media Matters, right, in the book, and you really got into, you broke it down, all the different companies, all the different organizations that work together to try to convey their message, and who funded them in some cases, right? You talked about that. Do you think that what's happening with the nominee, Judge Kavanaugh, could be another chapter in your book in the future about smearing?
It's pretty classic in terms of we don't know what really happened for the woman that's come forward, maybe accusations, there may be no way to really know. It sounds like there isn't contemporary evidence that we can turn to. But I look at the way it was presented. If it was appropriate to hear out somebody that has no evidence, but you decide the claim is so important that maybe you want to hear it, it seems to me this should have and would have taken place during the hearings when they knew about it. It seems to me, just guessing, there was a decision made that either her case was not strong enough to do so, or that it would give him a chance to address and rehabilitate his image in the hearings and therefore wouldn't do much good. So this was withheld until, you know, the 11th hour for the purposes, looks to me, like to delay and obfuscate and try to throw up a lot of roadblocks. And then, so you combine that with the Me Too movement and the fear everybody has, Republicans and Democrats alike, of saying anything like, we shouldn't listen to her, and they say the opposite. Well, let's listen to her. I mean, kind of in this atmosphere, any strange person could make an allegation about any powerful person, and if we're to hold the presses based on no other evidence, gosh, I wonder what that's going to lead to as we move forward in our government with politicians and Supreme Court nominees.
I was listening to the commentator, and he was saying that people who seek positions of power, like a Supreme Court nominee, somebody running for federal office, that they know the game and they should expect this, and if they didn't want to deal with it, then they should not allow themselves to throw their name in the ring for whatever position it is. What do you think about that? Is smearing that common and that understood? And
I don't know if it's fully understood until it happens to you. You may understand, I'm sure Kavanaugh knew, and everybody on the Trump list, or any list for such thing, understands they're going to be examined. They've been oppo-researched, as we call it, from the day their names became public, if not sooner. So I think they get that. But it's hard, I think it would be hard for anybody to have predicted that the presses could be stopped at the 11th hour after the hearings by what's happening now. And I think that part of the impact of this, both sides try to do it and corporations try to do it, it's not just aimed at the one target, it's to have a chilling effect at everybody. Maybe think of the different kinds of candidates we'll get for different things if it does scare away ordinary people who think, I just can't put my family through that. I can't, either I did do something or I didn't do something and someone's going to say I did, and how do I put my family through this and weather it? I think part of that is sort of to have a chilling effect on certain candidates.
And the people who are doing the smearing learn for next time what worked and what didn't work. And so one of the things that surprised me in the book, The Smear, was about how, you know, a lot of times people see the world as a Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, and like a two-dimensional world, but it's really not. It's 1,000-dimensional. And the one that really stood out to me was when you talked about the Bush administration and Christine Todd Whitman when she was at the EPA. She worked for the Bush administration. And then what happened?
Well, you have to just get so sneaky in the way you think about how things are being decided. Emails later revealed Christine Todd Whitman was the head of the Environmental Protection Agency and had put out some kind of report, or the EPA under her, that gave validity to global warming, didn't come across with the message the Bush administration wanted her to have. So there's this whole side deal that some administration officials were taking with a nonprofit group or an advocacy group to try to convince them to sue themselves. You know, they want the advocacy group to sue the Bush administration, but this was the Bush administration proposing it because they were mad at Christine Todd Whitman and the report that came out. So these emails made that very, very clear. And she was fired or let go or had to resign a short time after that. But you know, the things that go on within the parties or the alliances that are made are often.
And I think she's still, it's still the shortest tenure of a cabinet
I think that's right,
post. Is it maybe like a couple months or something? Yeah. So it's not, there's a lot of things going on. What are the tactics that smear operators do or use that we, the public, don't see in this 1,000-dimensional game of chess?
Well, I wrote down a couple so I wouldn't forget, because a couple I think are pretty important. Wikipedia is one, Snopes is one, and those two sources fool us, in my view, by putting out some good information and good fact checks. But then nestled in there are tactics and people who are using it to mislead us. Wikipedia is largely controlled by what I call agenda editors who develop power. They can revert any edit. So Wikipedia calls itself the encyclopedia anybody can edit. So if you go on there, you're supposed to be able to add a footnoted reference to something. But it turns out, if you go to a page someone's protecting, maybe a pharmaceutical company that doesn't want you to know a drug has certain side effects, maybe a political issue, try to make an edit on that page. It'll revert back within minutes, sometimes seconds. Someone's watching that to make sure that page reads a certain way. I've seen biographies that do that, biographies of people that only highlight the negative. I've seen biographies that only highlight the positive. Both of those violate Wikipedia's supposed policies, but these agenda editors that have a lot of power, some of them are PR companies that understood with Wikipedia the way to get editing power, mine is better than yours is, who's ever been there the longest and made the most edits. And they saw years ago, these PR companies, wow, they started making a lot of edits just to build their way up the editing chain, and now they hold all the cards. So if I try to change my own biography, because it says I was born in Sarasota and I was born in St. Pete, they won't let me do it in my own biography. There's a funny story about a guy named Philip Roth, who was an author, who noticed on his Wikipedia page that a novel he wrote, they kept attributing the inspiration for a character to something that wasn't true. So he had his secretary go in and try to change it, and change a map. And finally he reached somebody at Wikipedia and said, why do you keep changing my page back? And they said, well, you're not considered an expert on yourself. It's a true story. So he had to get them to change it, write a letter to the editor in the New York Times so that he could refer to that as a footnote. They didn't believe him when he said that was the inspiration for his character, but once it was published in the New York Times, I believe they eventually let him change his page. That's just a crazy example of...
Well, and you have your own website that you publish information on, link. And so, trying to put this together over the past year, I was doing my research on you, and I don't know if you know this, but if you Google yourself, your website doesn't come up first, SharylAttkisson.com doesn't come up first, Wikipedia comes up first.
Wikipedia is just, ubiquitous, and that's what makes it kind of dangerous. A couple more tactics. Social media, they use fake accounts and robotic accounts to publish, one actor, as they say. You can see solicitations, the government does this, corporations do that. They have software that one actor can maintain, say 20 accounts that look like they're coming from separate IP addresses, that look like they're linked to friends and have had those friends for years, that look like they've met up with people, and then they can all create movements and interact with people in a way that looks real. Comments on websites, you probably know this, certain stories and people are followed and trolled, so everything they write, someone will counter, or make them controversial by the comments. Comedy shows, late night comedy shows, they're on the talking points du jour, they're on lists that get, here's what we're talking about. These are from groups that put out talking points and narratives. Ethics and watchdog groups are often part of this. Nonprofits, LLCs, website, PR groups. Ghost-written letters to the editor. This doesn't surprise me anymore, but when I first learned of it, letters to the editor in major publications are I won't say usually because I don't know the frequency, but are often not written by the people who sign them. Or the people who sign them are paid for their signature, but some corporate interest or political interest wrote them and convinced them to let them use their name. And the newspapers know this full well. Fake or confusing science and scientific publications. I interviewed the former head of the New England Journal of Medicine, Marcia Angel, and the head of British journal Lancet. Both have said you can believe very little, most they said, of what is in these scientific publications is not to be believed. This is a shocking admission of this story because it's been so co-opted by industry and the studies are not real, the studies are conflicted science or they're put out to confuse. Think tanks, doctors, universities, these university professors and universities are paid and hired and contributed by corporate and political interests to come up with position papers and letters to the editor and statements. And so they're just a few of the ways.
Yeah, and I think it was in the 50s, the sugar industry convinced professors at Harvard to blame fat for obesity and things being unhealthy. And so it's an old game, but like you said, it's with the internet and these things that they'll use any tool that they have to take advantage. What is something similar? What is transactional journalism?
So I call transactional journalism this secret world in which we as reporters communicate, negotiate with the people we report on in ways that I think crosses a line. Like, we always have to have a relationship with people that we may be getting information from. We want them to answer our emails. But when it comes to us promising them certain treatment, letting them review our stories in advance, making deals with them so that we get something in return, I call that transactional journalism, and it's happening all the time. And I wrote down some emails if you want to read some of them.
Please.
Here's some examples, because we got these from Freedom of Information requests and different things that have been made public over the years. I'm sure there are examples from all political realms where this type of thing goes on, but there was a big batch of emails that came out, had to do with Hillary Clinton and the Clinton campaign, so we have those, in the Obama administration. So one of them is Washington reporter Mark Ambender from The Atlantic, who's also written for New York Times, New Yorker, Washington Post, Vice, Frontline, ABC News, CBS News. People who do this kind of journalism are very popular. In 2009, Secretary of State Clinton was about to make a speech, and normally, Secretary of State's sort of dry speech, you would have to, her aide, Philippe Rines, would have to try to convince people to cover it, but not when it comes to transactional journalism. In today's dynamic, someone's decided, gee, if we can get an advance copy of her speech, that's a great get. So he wants to know, can he get this advance copy? And what does he have to do to get it? So in an email exchange, the Clinton aide, Rines, tells the reporter Ambender there are certain conditions he must meet in order to get text of the speech. The reporter replies, okay. Rines, Hillary Clinton's aide, dictates the terms in a numbered list of the email. Number 1, he says, you must in your own voice describe Hillary's words as muscular. Number 2, you must note that a look at the audience seating plan shows that the envoys will be arrayed in front of her, which in your own clever way you will say is not a coincidence and meant to convey something. And number 3, you don't say you were blackmailed. So,
By the way.
yeah. Does the reporter say, no, I'm sorry, this kind of crosses a line? No, he writes back in an email, got it. So here's what his final article said. When you think of President Obama's foreign policy, think of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That's the message behind a muscular speech that Clinton is set to deliver today. And he delivered on the other demands as well. When the emails got exposed, Ambender insisted they didn't capture the totality of his communication and were not indicative of his normal reporting techniques. He said, the way Rines described the Clinton speech, it was muscular. So I found the adjective appropriate. So muscular was my word. No one fed me anything. So then I wrote, this is in the smear. So it must be coincidence then that I found other reporters thought of the exact same unusual adjective, also in describing the same Clinton speech. Another Washington fixture, Mike Allen of Politico, formerly New York Times and Time, also called the speech muscular and noted the seating arrangement as the Clinton aide had instructed Ambender to do. Likewise, the headline at New York Magazine used the word muscular, and the article showed at the time a cartoon of Clinton with bodybuilder arms. Let's see, a couple more funny things. Ambender emailed Clinton aide Rines in 2009 after she was on NBC's Meet the Press. She kicked A. And another time he gushed after she gave a press conference, this is an awesome presser. She is pitch effing perfect. Then an AP reporter, Ken Delanian, he previously covered the CIA for the LA Times. And there's some emails from him in 2012 which reveal a surprisingly deferential collaborative relationship, according to The Intercept, who got the emails, with the CIA. So I'll summarize just by saying he was sending stories to them in advance to the CIA and kind of asking for the input, how to correct them or fix them or make them different, and then obliged with whatever they suggested. Mike Allen from Politico, I think he's left there now, but he was with Politico. As Obama was being sworn into his second term, he wants an interview with Clinton's daughter, Chelsea, which is not really a great get, but in Washington circles, he'll be patted on the back and told, oh, you got an interview with Chelsea, that's awesome. So he's writing in an email how he would get the interview. He says in the email, this would be a way to send a message during inaugural week, trying to persuade them. No one besides me would ask Chelsea a question, and you and I would agree on the questions precisely in advance, he's saying to the aide. He also offered favorable conditions. This would be a relaxed conversation, and our innovative format always gets heavy social media pickup. The interview would be no surprises. I would work with you on topics and would start with anything she wants to cover or make news on. So I call that fake news in terms of, that's a violation of agreeing in advance to work up questions with the interviewee. I'll point out he didn't get the interview. I don't know why, because it's a generous offer that he gave. And then when the emails were made public, he published an brief item in Politico that was called "My Bad." And he wrote, "You may have missed a Gawker post last week that rightly took me to task for something clumsy I wrote in an email to Philippe Ryan seeking an interview with Chelsea Clinton. In the email, I said I'd agree to the questions in advance. I have never done that and would never do that. Politico has a policy against it, and it would make for a boring event. We didn't do the interview and would never clear our questions, but the email makes me cringe because I never should have suggested that we would."
So they're trading off their professionalism, they're trading off their ethics, they're trading off their standards for access.
And I think it's for a perception of access that really nobody cares about. Like, that's not the story that's going to bring something to light that anybody really cares that much about. So you're trading your tenets of ethics and journalism for something that doesn't even mean that much.
Sure. Good examples, good examples. What do so you have that realm of journalism and media, but now, in the last 10 or 15 years, you throw in the wild card of social media. How does that impact the smear business?
Well, that's a free way, virtually free way, that these actors that I've discussed learn that they can use to manipulate the news and public opinion, through the social media, through Twitter. There was one guy I interviewed for the smear, former military official who works in this, what I call a smear industry now, who said to me, you can start an entire movement with a handful of fake Twitter accounts and 140 characters. And I was just like, wow, they're very much aware of this, what they have, which is why I think in part there's these efforts to try to control it. At the same time that it's easy to manipulate people through social media, it's also very easy for people to find alternate opinions and their truth or different ideas right now, and I think that's what people are trying to stop. But the internet has made all of this, as they say, travel with the speed of light. You can get a smear going within 15 minutes. You can get it on the news.
It's something you said, people can find opinions that they like. And, those of us who are on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, I have friends, we have friends who you see their posts, and I just look at the source and I know that it's not credible. But they found something that made them feel justified or happy or agreed with their opinion, and it's kind of nonstop. But it's not unique to one's ideological set. It's people all over the place who are now in these bunkers. When I was young in college and I would do my research papers, I would start off with the argument that I wanted to make, and then I would find research that supported that argument. That's not how you're supposed to write.
Right.
So what we teach our students is you go out and you do as much research as you can, and you figure out try to find out what the truth is or get some insight. But with the diversity of fake news and things on social media, people can live in their own news bunker and live a total different existence than somebody who sits right next to them. That seems dangerous.
It may be. It's just accelerated what you can do in your personal life because you can find more people who are like-minded. But I would argue that it's even more dangerous to invite third parties, whether it's the government or Google and whoever backs Google, to invite them to be the ones to arbitrate what it is we do see and what we do.
Absolutely.
It's a difficult question.
So, transition again. I know there's a lot of people here tonight who are interested in your case with the Department of Justice. So, and then there's also my students here who have no idea. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that and giving people an update on what happened and where that stands.
Around late fall of 2013, and I was covering a number of controversies under the Obama administration, as I did under Bush, but two separate sources connected to the intelligence community approached me and said that I was likely being monitored by the government because of the reporting that I was doing, particularly what was being published online, because a lot of it wasn't being published on CBS. I was publishing it on their website because I couldn't get it on TV. And it sounded crazy at the time, because now we all accept that we understand what the government has been doing, I think, largely. But in late 2013, Edward Snowden hadn't come forward, and the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, hadn't yet provided false testimony to Congress claiming there was no mass surveillance. We later found out there was. We didn't know that Associated Press records had been subpoenaed, I think improperly by our government and secretly to find their sources. We didn't know that Fox News' James Rosen had been labeled a co-conspirator in Department of Justice papers, a possible criminal co-conspirator, and that his records had been looked at and that of his family. So this all sounded crazy until, long story short, through connections and friends, I was able to get a forensic review of my CBS computer first that immediately came back as positive by a government forensic expert for government software being in there and long-term monitoring effort in my computers. 3 classified documents had been planted deep in my operating system. They had used Skype. If you have Skype on your computer, you should know this. They can activate Skype when it doesn't look like it's on, to listen into the room, to hear conversation, and they can exfiltrate files through that program somehow. They had access to the CBS computer program, a lot of things we had records of. There's been 6 separate forensics teams and exams that continue working on this case because I filed suit in, it's probably 2014, with the help of an attorney. Filed suit against the government to try to get the names of the people responsible and to get some accountability, which is almost impossible. Because Department of Justice to this day has unlimited taxpayer money and time and resources to fight the suit. And I don't, but I'm giving it the college try with the help of some people that are offering their services because they think this is a very important case. But the point is, I know I wasn't the only reporter this happened to. I just happened to have the contacts that could look. There was a WikiLeaks document printed, I believe it was around 2010, that I think serves as the backdrop for a lot of my case and a lot of what's been going on with inappropriate surveillance. And it was an exchange between executives at a company called Stratford, which is a government contractor that's called the Shadow CIA, some people call it. And so they were talking about intelligence they had internally. And the head or the one executive was saying to the other that, let's quote something like, Brennan is behind the witch hunt of inside the Beltway journalists reporting things that are negative to the Obama agenda. And went on to say there's a specific tasker at the White House assigned to crack down on any of these journalists learning from inside the Beltway sources. And I think that's sort of what I stumbled across, what was happening to me and other reporters who were covering this. I think they've also been, our intelligence communities, bad actors within them, and I have some sources in there, have been improperly surveilling political officials, other Americans, all kinds of people. And in my own opinion, this is part of why the backlash against Trump, it's not just because they dislike Trump or hate his policies. It's more because Trump was coming in outside the Democrat and established Democrat and Republican figures and was going to, with some of the people he had, dig into this and expose what I think and what some of my sources say are crimes that have been committed by some people inside of government over the past 10, 15 years or more, not just what happened in 2016. So there's a desperation to not let him do that, lest these things be uncovered. 2 people in the last 6 months of my sources have said people are going to go to prison for this, meaning intelligence community people.
It's good if we have the technology to spy on terrorists or people who are going to do us harm. So I don't think we don't have a problem with the technology. It's how it's used, and anything with power has to have checks and safeties on it. But I want to clarify, because you said that this happened under the Obama administration. Your lawsuit against the Department of Justice continues, and nothing has changed with President Trump. It's not like he came in and said, yeah, we did this reporter wrong, we're going to make it right, we're going to declassify this information. They're still fighting it, is that correct?
Yes. I think very little changes inside what I call a persistent bureaucracy. So nothing changed in terms of my suit. My case, after last fall, finally got assigned a judge and started moving after several years of being stagnant in D.C. It was assigned to Virginia. The judge told the Department of Justice, which is constantly roadblocking, she said twice, this case is not going away. And then she summarily dismissed it about 2 months ago.
Wow.
So we just filed our appeal with the 4th Circuit Court of Appeal. This is another thing that bugs me. The government has a deadline to answer, and they got an extension. I'm like, how do you need it? You have every resource and dollar and money and people. Why do you get an extension to make your answer? It is. And I will tell you, part of what, again, these are my theories, part of what happened when Trump got in is there was an effort to make him so afraid to do anything with his own Justice Department, which is actually what every president does. They interface directly on enforcement priorities and stuff with their Justice Department. They wanted him to be so afraid to do so, so he would stay away, that they scared him. Oh, obstruction, there's investigations. And when I interviewed him, I've interviewed him maybe a couple times since he was president, maybe twice. I had a little note about my lawsuit. So I folded it up. It's like, and it turns out you're not supposed to hand stuff to the president. but he took it, and he looked at it, and he said, "This is your case?" Because I just gave some facts. And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "I know, it's terrible." And he said, "But I've been told I can't mess with the Justice Department." I mean, I really think his own instincts would be, what ought to happen? Our forensics are undeniable. Their fingerprints,
Digital fingerprints.
Digital fingerprints with this stuff that we found. It's not in dispute that it was the government IP addresses that we recovered from the computer. So the Justice Department ought to come forward and quit spending taxpayer money fighting my suit, apologize, and just promise to get to the bottom of it. And that could happen, someone could wave a wand and have that happen tomorrow, but someone doesn't want that to happen.
Sure, absolutely. Wanted to talk about if the smear is that prevalent, and everybody knows that that's going on in DC and other seats of power, why does it seem like politicians and public officials are so fired up by it? Do they drink their own Kool-Aid? Like in this bubble of Washington, D.C., do they believe the smear?
That's a good way to put it. They're scared of it.
Okay.
And if you start to think like Alice in Wonderland world, and this again, these are my opinions, most of them are not operating based on what we want them to do. They're operating based on this weird extra-constitutional system that's evolved on the Hill, that's unauthorized, but nonetheless rules everything. What their leadership tells them to do, which leadership can tell them how to vote, what to think, when to hold a hearing, when not to hold a hearing, because leadership controls the money. And if you're a member, actually this Sunday we'll be doing a story that touches on some of this with a member of Congress, sitting member. If you're a member of your own party, Democrat or Republican, who doesn't go along with the agenda, and the agenda may be dictated because powerful interests are giving a lot of money to the party, and you don't go along, you won't survive election. Your own party will use their money to run somebody against you. We'll make sure that you're never on an important committee, which you have to be to raise money, to raise your quotas. They actually give them quotas of fundraising they have to do, and then they fundraise for the interests they're supposed to oversee to meet the quotas. It's all about that. Like, we're just on the outside of all of this. It's not really about...
We live in a different world.
Yeah. And then it's about, I always say, they live in that world that we see on the news and on social media. They're watching that minute by minute. If we would all just turn that off, there's a whole different world outside that has different opinions, I think. There's a lot of effort and money put into making us live in that world where they can kind of control what we see and think is happening, so that we feel like we're an outlier if we don't agree with this prevailing opinion, when we may actually be of a majority opinion, but we're just not going to see that on Twitter.
And you said in the book that you had somebody tell you that everything that makes it to the news has been placed there by somebody, some interest.
This is another smear operator who spoke, he gave me a lot of inside information, which is what I wanted for the book, but I couldn't quote him by name. But I got chills when he said this to me. We were sitting down having breakfast or something, and he said, every image the public sees in their daily life is put there for a reason, often by an interest that paid a lot of money to put up there. And then he likened it to a movie. He said it's like a movie. No scene happens by accident. No narrative is random that you see on the news. And it made me think of The Truman Show, which I wrote in the book. You ever saw The Truman Show? And now it's an old movie. It doesn't seem that old. But where everything is going on around him, and he's the only one that doesn't understand the universe around him isn't as it seems. It's very manipulated. And that's what I think of. And I think often when you hear the same themes on the news, I like to say there are thousands of news stories that could be reported on the news in a given day. When they've all chosen the same 3 stories, there's a reason for that. There's usually a reason for that. And I try on, I'm not just trying to pitch my show, because I'm sure you can get it on some off channel here right now, but I'm not trying to just look for viewers, but I try to go off narrative. I don't want to have what everybody else has. And when everybody does, it's a reason. They're looking at talking points, they're listening to certain analysts. They're sort of being, I think, captive to the narrative du jour that's being put out instead of doing this original thinking and original reporting. And we're not learning much when we switch from channel to channel.
I think that was one of the takeaways that I got from reading the book, was that I don't get upset as much as I used to when I watch the news. And because it is, you point out how it's manufactured, and it's there for a reason, and a lot of it is to elicit a response. So, I don't know that that's why you wrote the book, but that was one of the things that I took from it, was that, a lot of the things that I used to get upset about with politics, maybe that's not really what's important or what's going on right now, or it's not as important as it happens to seem on the news.
And I would say, when you have that sense of cognitive dissonance, like you look online or you look on the news and everybody's saying something and you're like, that's not what I think, or that doesn't seem true, don't fall for it. I say trust that voice inside yourself, turn off the news, turn off the computer, and know that there may be some, it doesn't mean what you're seeing is wrong, but it may be wrong, or it may be out of context, or it may not be representing different views. So trust, don't fall for the notion that you have to think, and I think most of you probably don't if you're here today, but don't fall for the notion that what you see, no matter how many sources they have, and no matter how many places they're saying it, is necessarily the case, or the end of the story. Like, there's usually so much more to almost anything you're being told.
Yeah, and I'll have one last question for me, and then if you want to give any final comments or thoughts. But you seem like a pretty happy person. I've met you twice now.
Well, I was like flat on my back.
Yeah, pretty normal, and just
pretty normal.
Yeah, you've seen some of the worst things of humanity when you've traveled the world and done your stories. You've seen some of the worst cases of government corruption. How can you see that and kind of stay so positive and normal?
Am I normal, Stacy? Vicky? Normal-ish? For me, I don't know that this translates to other people, but for my job, not compromising, finding a way to operate in my industry, and happy to still be here, because I didn't think after I quit CBS who would want to hire me. But operating in a truthful way, there's a very slippery slope once you start doing the things that they want to make the story better, to make it come out the way they wish, or to not show certain views. Once you start that, I think it's a very slippery slope, a lousy feeling, and I always felt like, maybe without planning it, that at the end of the day, I like what I did, even if I took flack for it from certain interests and all that, I was happy with what I did. And I get my satisfaction, not out of the notion that I have to change your mind or make you think something with a story, but just by putting facts out there that are hard for you to get otherwise, or maybe you're not getting elsewhere. And that has to be where my satisfaction level is. Someone said to me, oh, well, someone may not see the story on MRI die. I'm like, I can't make everybody see it, but it's there if people want to find it, and I'm glad I was able to do that. So I guess I look for little accomplishments and find satisfaction in those. And if you know who you are, and the more I've understood this industry, the smear industry that we've talked about, and I do turn off social media, I read it and I promote my stories on it, but I also understand what it is. The more you kind of understand that and keep it in perspective, it doesn't get you so worked up. I don't have a whole lot of bad. If someone says really mean, horrible, abusive, bad language stuff on Twitter, I block them, and most people don't. And if they disagree, I'm actually okay with it, and then some people will get in a conversation with me and end up being like these two guys that picked on me mercilessly are now kind of my friends. They still pick on me, but we laugh about it. I just try to not take stuff real personally and not take things too seriously if they're not meant to be, and I understand what the medium does, what its limits are.
Excellent, that's great. Was there anything else you wanted any wisdom or any final offerings for the people here?
Well, I would just say, when you see themes in your environment that are common, and common language being used. There's some examples in my book. Common words being used that don't seem like, why is everybody using the same words to describe this speech? Not a word I would have thought of, muscular. You can suspect that there might be an organized effort to just get you thinking a little bit more. When I watch the news now, I literally believe nothing of what I see at first blush. Nothing. No matter how many people are reporting it, no matter how many sources the New York Times said they had, because so many times that's turned out to be wrong. I have a running list, I think, of 58 major media mistakes in the era of Trump on my website, SharylAttkisson.com, that just major, if this had been done 10 years ago, by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the networks, these people would be banned from the industry, but now it's just common. You know, these big mistakes are made, and everybody goes, oh, sorry, it was an accident, it goes on. But be on the lookout. It doesn't mean what you're seeing reported isn't true. It may be, but just understand that there's almost always more to the story. And you know, don't jump to conclusions, and trust your instincts and your cognitive dissonance, and understand the medium and the world that we're operating in.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Sharyl